Hi, welcome back to Educator.com. This is the lesson on the lymphatic system. So we look at the functions of the lymphatic system. Basically, it involves the production, maintenance, and distribution of lymphocytes, which is a major kind of white blood cell. And these provide defense, of course, against infections, which we can call pathogens. That's viruses, bacteria, fungi, even parasitic worms. Even abnormal body cells, your own body cells, sometimes get mutations, maybe get a buildup of toxins, and something about them is abnormal. Maybe they're turning into cancer cells. You want a certain class of white blood cells to ideally get rid of them as soon as possible. And foreign proteins. So foreign proteins, which are usually associated with some kind of pathogen, but not always, those can cause problems as well. So they're going to be dealing with them. These protective cells are found throughout the bloodstream, in lymphatic organs, and they can also migrate into tissues. The amazing thing is scientists have tracked white blood cells changing their shape and squeezing through the border of the endothelial lining of a capillary or of blood vessels in general, and moving in and out of organs. That's amazing to think about them not just being restricted to the bloodstream. They can actively go into tissues and deal with infections in there, which is great. And this system, the lymphatic system, is also known as the lymphoid system in certain textbooks and the immune system. So when we look at this lymph tissue, the reason why it's called the lymphatic system, lymph is the fluid of the system circulating around the body. This is one of the least talked about systems in terms of people's general knowledge of it, but it's one of the more important ones because without lymph and without sort of this screening process in your tissues, you'd get sick way more often. I mean, yes, people still do get sick, but even something like the common cold, the reason why you get better within a few days is because of your lymphatic system. So the lymph is really just the fluid of it, analogous to plasma of blood, but the precise amount of proteins in it, the precise makeup of lymph is slightly different than plasma, but that's found all throughout these regions. The lymphatic vessels is what's actually moving the lymph through the parts of the body. These vessels, you're going to hear more about them later on in the lesson. Similar to blood vessels, there are some differences. Lymph nodes are these little circular pockets that you see throughout here. You'll see more pictures later on. But lymph nodes are kind of like miniature lymph organs, little collections of lymph fluid, and where some white blood cells will be hanging out. The lymphoid organs, a little bit bigger, we're talking organs like the adenoids or the tonsils, thymus gland behind the sternum, and then the spleen, this organ that's tucked under next to the stomach. Those have a lot to do with helping out with the lymphatic system. And then lymphocytes. These are the cells, the white blood cells specifically, of the lymphatic system. And then later on we'll also be talking about non-specific defenses versus specific defenses, and acquired immunity versus passive immunity. Non-specific defenses is the general things your body does regardless of what's invaded it, regardless of what abnormal thing is present, to combat that situation. Things like a fever. A fever is going to happen regardless of having some kind of bacterial infection in your respiratory tract or a viral infection in your respiratory tract. The fever is going to happen with either. But specific defenses is, hey, for this specific bacteria that's entered, your white blood cells are going to do something very particular to combat that. Certain virus entering your body, very particular things are going to happen. So those are the specific defenses to combat particular invasions. So when we look at the lymphatic vessels, we're going from thickest to smallest, kind of like saying from arteries to arterioles to capillaries. In this case, major lymphatic vessels, these are the deepest ones, just like arteries are going to be deeper than capillaries, especially when we're talking about the skin. But major lymphatic vessels, these are going to be deeper, and they're going to branch off into small lymphatic vessels and finally into lymphatic capillaries. Basically, the large lymphatic vessels contain valves for maintaining normal lymph flow, similar to the reason why veins in your circulatory system or cardiovascular system are allowing blood to continue to go in one direction. It's the same thing here. The reason why you have valves in lymphatic vessels is because you don't want your lymph your lymphatic fluids to be pooling in one area. That can cause something called lymphedema, which I'm going to talk about more at the end, but you want to keep the drainage of this lymph constant, and you don't want it to build up in any one area. So the valves assist with keeping that unidirectional flow. Lymphatic capillaries are present in almost every tissue of the body. Almost every tissue. That's amazing to think about because, hey, lymphatic capillaries, they're kind of like assisting your bloodstream in screening out harmful things and kind of almost like dealing like with security checkpoints in a sense. So it's great that these tiny little capillaries containing this lymph fluid are associated with virtually every tissue. But they do differ, the vessels, from blood capillaries because they originate as pockets, not as continuous tubes. So if you think about how blood moves around the body, it is a continuous tubular network, and the origin of the red blood cells is going to be from typically bone marrow. But your lymph originates in little pockets and then drains out. So in these little pockets is where you're producing the lymph fluid, and then it's exiting out constantly and kept going in that direction thanks to the valves. They typically do have larger diameters than the blood vessels, but thinner walls. And also the endothelial cells of these lymphatic vessels overlap. So if you looked at the endothelial lining of blood cells, those cells are flush with each other. They're directly adjacent, not like this. So you're going to see some overlapping endothelial cells if you zoomed in really close on a micrograph or microscopic picture of the lymphatic vessels, the inner lining. All right, these lymph nodes, these are the small lymphoid organs that vary in size depending on which one you're looking at. Some of them are 1 millimeter in diameter, some are 25 millimeters in diameter, which is quite large. Most are concentrated in the neck, armpits, and groin. And you generally don't think about them until you go to the doctor. Maybe you're sick. The reason why the doctor would feel this area of your neck if you're claiming that you have some kind of cough that won't go away or a sore throat is they're really checking whether or not your lymph nodes are swollen here. So if your lymph nodes are a little bit inflamed and a little bit puffy in this area, that tells you that your lymph nodes are kind of working overtime. That inflammation in those regions means you're probably combating or fighting against some kind of infection. And they're also going to be located in the armpits and in the groin region. But they are scattered throughout. It's just they tend to be more concentrated in these regions. And the lymph nodes, they function like a kitchen water filter in terms of filtering out bad stuff before it ends up going back into the bloodstream. So it purifies the lymph, that fluid that is associated with the lymphatic system, before it enters into the veins. Macrophages, which means giant eaters, a kind of a white blood cell, in the lymphatic sinuses, just pockets of the lymphatic system, engulf or swallow foreign bodies like antigens. We'll talk more about antigens later, which are presented to lymphocytes. And this process here, the antigens presenting them to the lymphocytes, that's a major part of you enabling your white blood cells to know what the bacteria has on it, what the virus has on it in terms of protein structure, and being able to identify it quickly and kick its butt, get rid of it out of your body. So this is a little drawing of the pelvic region near the groin, and you could see all these little brown circular objects. These are lymph nodes scattered throughout, and the lymph nodes are connected to each other by lymphatic vessels. All right, now in terms of the larger lymphoid organs, one of them is the thymus. To hear more about the thymus, if you look at the endocrine system lessons, I talk more about the hormone function of the thymus, but here is more structural information. So it's located in the mediastinum, posterior to the sternum, near the heart. It contains lobules, and these lobules, they're about 2 millimeters in diameter. Here's a little cross section. So if we took a slice through the thymus and looked down into it, this is a lobule or lobule. Here are these different lobules, and each one has 2 distinct layers, kind of like in the kidney or the adrenal gland. Once again, we're using the terms cortex and medulla. So the cortex is the outer region, the medulla is inner. So if we look at the outermost part, that's where lymphocytes are dividing. Lymphocytes making more lymphocytes, making more lymphocytes. And those daughter cells, the products of those mitotic divisions, as they move into the medulla, that's where they're going to undergo maturation. So the T cells is the specific ones we're talking about here. And the way that I remember that is thymus starts with a T, so T cells mature in the thymus. There's another kind of lymphocyte called B cells, which we're going to talk about more later at the end of this lesson. So these T cells, as they migrate into the medulla, they tend to leave and actually go out into the vessels after about 3 weeks. They're ready to go. And there's different types of T cells, which we're going to go over in a bit. Hormones from this gland promote the maturation of lymphocytes, specifically the T cells. The spleen, another important but not vital organ, it contains the largest amount of lymphoid tissue in the body. It's red because of the large amount of blood flow. The thymus has a reddish appearance too, but the spleen is much more deep, dark red. It's about 12 centimeters long, about 160 grams in mass, or 5.6 ounce weight, and lies lateral to the stomach on the left between ribs 9 and 11. So it's kind of a next door neighbor of the stomach. The stomach is right in this region. So ribs 9 and 11, that's almost all the way down, because rib 12, that's the last pair. So it is protected by the bottom of the thoracic cage. This is one of those organs that I said is not a vital organ, because sometimes doctors will do a splenectomy, a taking out of the spleen. If, let's say you were in an accident, you fell on it, a collision in some kind of contact sport ruptures the spleen and there's internal bleeding, you got to take it out, because that can kill a person. If you do get a splenectomy, if it's taken out, you can live a perfectly fine life, but you're going to be a little bit more susceptible to certain illnesses, because the spleen does assist your lymphatic system in dealing with different infections. So there are areas in the spleen called pulp, and you can see from this cross section, this is a transverse cross section looking down into it. You can see that there's white areas and there's red areas. The red areas, the reason why they're red is because red blood cells. That makes sense. The white areas is where you have sort of that lymphoid section, the area that has a lot more lymphocytes, kind of screening the blood that's coming in and dealing with harmful things that don't belong there. So it's like a highly patrolled security checkpoint area. In general, those little lymph nodes, they're like little security checkpoints, but this is where a lot of security is going on in terms of locating the harmful stuff that doesn't belong in your body and kicking its butt. All right, now in terms of the different kinds of defenses, we could talk first about non-specific defenses, and I mentioned these earlier, that the response in terms of your non-specific defenses is the same regardless of what's invading, and they also call it non-specific resistance. So one example is physical barriers. If you think about all the layers and parts of your body that, like, let's say air has to go through to finally get into your bloodstream, you have a lot of physical barriers. Think about the air you breathe in terms of, dust getting caught in the hairs of your nostrils, in the mucous membranes of your nasal mucosa. Then you swallow it sometimes, and it goes into the stomach where it's very, very acidic, and it's probably not going to survive that. If it's not being swallowed and it's actually being inhaled down into the trachea and bronchi, etc., you've got those cilia that are sweeping up mucus. You've got lymphatic patrols of the different alveolar bundles. There's so many physical barriers to finally, that has to pass before it finally gets into the bloodstream. So physical barriers, regardless of what you're being exposed to, virus, bacteria, fungus, there's a lot that you have protecting your body. Phagocytic cells. You have white blood cells patrolling the body, whose job it is to just swallow up stuff that doesn't belong there. And the classic example is monocytes. They're analogous to macrophages. Macrophages tend to be like kind of restricted to certain areas outside the bloodstream, but monocytes constantly patrolling and just swallowing up stuff that doesn't belong there. And phagocytosis is the surrounding of some foreign body or even a large molecule by wrapping the plasma membrane around it and bringing it in a little vesicle and then attacking it, killing it. Immunological surveillance. This is pretty much equal to what the natural killer cells are doing. NK cells. Natural killer cells. These are white blood cells whose job it is to kill your own body cells that are becoming abnormal. They are abnormal. This happens all the time, and there are some people out there who, for instance, they might be smokers for 40, 50, 60 years or more and never get cancer. They just die of a heart attack in their 90s or older. And you wonder, how did they not get cancer? It could be that they have genetic factors making their natural killer cells just really awesome at their job. So anytime that some abnormal cell growth happened in their respiratory tract, the natural killer cells nipped it in the bud and just, destroyed it before it could turn into cancer. Some people's natural killer cells are not doing the best job, and they tend to be more susceptible to cancerous growths occurring. So this is a way that you keep body cells in check if they're not doing what they're supposed to do. Interferons, these are chemicals that actually make it harder for something like a virus to keep spreading, and it actually will make cells in the region of where that virus is less susceptible to getting that virus coming into them. So interferons, regardless of what kind of virus infection you're exposed to, these secretions, these little peptides, these protein bits, they're going to make it so that you're more likely to defeat the virus. Inflammation, whether it's an allergy, bacteria, virus, whatever. Inflammation is your immune system's response to, it's a swelling thing. If something is in your bloodstream that doesn't belong there, there's going to be a stimulation to expand the blood vessels in that area, get more blood flow in terms of volume, and that's going to get more white blood cells to the area. And the more white blood cells go to the area, the more likely it is you're going to get rid of that infection quickly. Fever, fevers happen and they're very uncomfortable, but it serves a purpose. So here's the Celsius scale. Normal, it depends on the person. If we're talking Fahrenheit, it's going to be a different number, obviously, but 37 degrees Celsius, that's high 90s. 98.6 is what a lot of people say is normal. My normal is 98.2. Some people might be 98.3 is their normal baseline, but regardless of where you are in that 98 degree range, your regular body temperature is going to be about 37 degrees Celsius. If it gets up into high 37s or 38 degrees, 39 degrees Celsius, you're talking a fever. And that usually means that you are sick with something substantial. So the fever, if you're wondering, well, why does it happen? Why does my body heat go up? It makes it harder for the virus or bacteria to spread in that hotter environment. So it does serve a purpose, even though it causes us some discomfort and we end up sweating a lot and it's just not pleasant. It does serve a purpose. There are medications that will reduce your fever, but still enable white blood cells to get the job done. All right, specific defenses. So depending on the particular type of pathogen, you're going to have very specific kinds of reactions to that. So this is known as immunity. When you become immune to something, that we're talking about a specific defense. So this is the coordinated activities of B cells and T cells, two major types of lymphocytes. So here's the two kinds of immunity. Innate immunity means you're born with it. You're born with the ability to react to different things that you're exposed to. You can't change that. So that's based on genetics. But a lot of immunity is acquired. It's picked up just by living, by you being exposed to different pathogens or foreign bodies. So when we talk about acquired immunity, what you gain as life goes on, you could talk about active acquired immunity versus passive acquired immunity. So active acquired immunity, how do you naturally acquire it? Well, a good example of that is think about a baby that's just been born and they get exposed to something, some germ. That's an example of how a baby can naturally acquire active immunity. So the baby's, sucking on something that had germs on it, well, introducing that bacteria from that toy, whatever they had in their mouth, that's going to allow their white blood cells to identify, be like, oh, okay, now we know what this is. We'll be able to prevent it spreading in the future. So that's just being exposed to stuff in your environment. Induced active immunity is vaccinations. So if you get an immunization is another term for it. A lot of kids these days are immunized against chickenpox. When I was a baby, they didn't have that in wide distribution in terms of getting a shot that gets rid of the chickenpox thing in the future. I got chickenpox when I was about 7 or 8, and chances are I'm not going to get it again because I have cells that have retained a memory of what that chickenpox virus was like. So if I'm exposed to it from someone in my environment, I'm not going to get sick. However, some people do get sick with chickenpox more than once because sometimes the second exposure, the genetics of that particular chickenpox virus was slightly different, so that it's not quite the same kind of signaling that your body is used to. So you might get sick a second time. But if you've been vaccinated, you've been exposed to the dead virus. It's like exposing your body to the non-active form of the virus. They look at the proteins like, oh, okay, that's what this thing's made of. And they're able to kind of retain a memory of what that's like. So if you are exposed to the live active virus from somebody touching you or whatever, then you're probably not going to get sick. Here's another interesting example of vaccinations. I found this image. I wasn't sure of the exact year, but it's probably from the 60s when smallpox was still an epidemic that was a problem. So this little announcement, be vaccinated this new year against smallpox. They say that smallpox has been completely eradicated. So as of, I believe it was the late 70s, the CDC, Center for Disease Control, they had for years been doing this campaign where they were trying to distribute smallpox vaccines all over the globe, places like Africa, Asia, Europe, etc., and even here in the United States. And then when you get to the point where enough people have been vaccinated so that they won't get sick with smallpox, and the people who currently have smallpox are no longer spreading it to others, the people with smallpox, once they pass away, the smallpox has no humans to be inside of and pass it along to other individuals. So we now consider this to be eradicated. There are smallpox samples in labs around the globe. Hopefully they stay there and aren't exposed to anybody, because we don't vaccinate people against this anymore. We do vaccinate with a lot of other kinds of things that are still out there. Now, moving on to passive acquired immunity. One example of passive acquired immunity in terms of it being naturally acquired is when you're a baby, getting antibodies from your mom. So not the actual surface of the virus or surface of the bacteria. You're getting antibodies either through the placental connection, which you can hear more about in the embryological lessons. But the placenta is how a baby gets its blood. And I'm going like this with my fingers because there's these connections that allow the mother's blood to end up going into the placental side that goes with the baby and through the umbilical cord. And that's how the baby gets all its oxygen and nutrients while it's developing. Sometimes you can have antibodies crossing through that placental barrier, so the baby is born with antibodies against some kind of bacteria. And that's amazing to think about. Also, breast milk can sometimes have antibodies coming out from the mother through the breast milk into the baby's body. So that's a naturally acquired passive immunity. And then induced passive immunity would be something like you can actually inject antibodies into somebody rather than injecting like the surface of a virus or something like that. So rabies, if somebody may have been exposed to rabies, you can inject antibodies into that person's bloodstream to help them deal with that particular infection. All right, T cells. What are these guys? So they're responsible for cell-mediated immunity, meaning not based on antibodies. So this is triggering cells to know how to conquer and defeat some kind of infection. So cytotoxic T cells is one of the kinds of T cells. These are just going up to places where there are viruses or bacteria in peripheral tissues, like just in the layers of your skin, in parts of your liver. They will migrate into those areas and just destroy them. They'll just eat them up and destroy them. And that's why they're called cytotoxic, because they have certain packages, little vesicles, you can call them lysosomes, that contain enzymes that are designed to help like eat up and destroy some kind of virus or bacteria. Now, helper T cells, the reason why they're called helper T cells is without their signaling, other T cells and B cells, another kind of lymphocyte, would not be successful. And helper T cells is the main kind of cell that HIV or AIDS is going to invade and destroy. Suppressor T cells, kind of the opposite of what T cells are doing. So helper, and I meant helper T cells, the opposite of this one, because helper T cells, they're helping out T cells and B cells in terms of stimulating them to do their job. But suppressor T cells, they tell them, hey, back off. They'll be responsible for stimulating them to kind of hold back and not have as many cell divisions. And if an infection is over, if it's been defeated, suppressor T cells are going to turn off that reaction. So to be activated, T cells must be exposed to an antigen. And an antigen is usually some kind of protein or proteinaceous kind of surface molecule. So if you look at a plasma membrane, there are these little proteins sticking out the surface of them. Those are antigens. Bacteria are going to have antigens on them. Viruses going to have antigens on them. Even the surface of a parasitic worm is going to have certain proteins that are unique to that species. The reason why it says abnormal plasma membrane proteins is it's abnormal to you. So you have your own particular proteins on the surface of all your cells based on your genetics, unique to your body. Even your brother, even your parents are going to have slightly different proteins. So the introduction of abnormal membrane proteins in your body, that's antigens. And your body will respond to those antigens with T cells and their butt-kicking abilities. The major histocompatibility complex proteins, or MHC proteins, are what allow your body to identify friendly cells versus abnormal cells. So friendly cells meaning your own normal body cells. Abnormal cells meaning virus. I mean, that's not really a cell, but viruses, bacteria cells, parasitic cells. This is going to have a certain protein composition, certain kinds of antigens that are not normal. And MHC proteins actually present foreign antigens. You're going to see a demonstration of that in a little bit, that MHC proteins, they will present an abnormal antigen. So let's say a cell got invaded by a virus, and that virus is actively making new viruses. It's using the machinery of that host cell to make a bunch of new viruses. That means they're making a bunch of abnormal proteins to your body. They're virus proteins. Well, the MHC will actually take the antigens and present them outside of the cell, and it's kind of like a flag, like a little white flag, like, help us. So that means some T cells are going to notice that, be exposed to that antigen, and then kind of signal other ones like, hey, we have a problem here. There's abnormal proteins in this cell. That means there's some kind of invasion from foreign bodies. All right, so here's this antigen presentation that I was just trying to kind of act out for you. Here is a cell that's been invaded. Let's say it's been invaded by a virus. So this is the antigen presenting cell. MHC, major histocompatibility complex protein. So you have a couple different classes of MHCs, but this MHC is going to take antigens and be like, look, here it is. When they say immature T cell, it's kind of like saying currently inactive. So it's a T cell that's looking for these abnormal antigen presentations. And rather than a white flag, it's better to say it's kind of like a red flag. We have a problem here. So this immature T cell, once it comes into contact with that antigen, then it's going to become activated. And this is going to tell, chemically, other cells, and it's going to cause cell divisions that are going to tell other T cells, hey, this is what you got to do. So a helper T cell, it's going to secrete things like interferons. I almost said interleukins. So interferons are those particular chemicals, peptide-based chemicals, that are going to signal cells like, hey, we have some kind of viral invasion. Be ready for this. Cytotoxic T cells, these are the ones that are going around and actually like actively eating up all of these other cells that are going to have the similar antigen presentation. Even if the virus has just invaded one cell, that virus is going to bust out of here and invade thousands of other cells. So if it wasn't for these cytotoxic T cells eating up the ones with the abnormal antigens, you'd have a problem, and that virus could destroy tissues. B cells. This is another kind of lymphocyte. These are responsible for the antibody kind of side of the story. Responsible for antibody-mediated immunity. And antibodies, if you watch the blood lessons from before, those are those like Y-shaped looking proteins that will attach to antigens. So the body, your body, has millions of these populations of B cells, and each kind of B cell has its own antibody molecules, matching certain classes of bacteria. Activated when they receive the OK from a helper T cell. So remember in the previous slide about sort of that signaling of like, hey, we got a problem here. So a helper T cell is going to be activated when there is a need for antibodies. And if there's no need, then you're not going to have the activation. More about antibodies in a bit. But memory B cells, these are similar to the class of T cells that is able to retain a memory in terms of the antigens that you've been introduced to. But these retain a memory on how to make antibodies. So when you are vaccinated against something, the reason why a vaccination will sometimes last like 10 years is memory B cells can live up to 20 years in your body, that same cell. I mean, compare that to red blood cells. Red blood cells will live like, hey, maybe 2 months, if that. But memory B cells last decades. And sometimes they say, hey, you need a booster shot. So I was vaccinated against meningitis a little over 10 years ago. A doctor would tell me like, hey, you need another meningitis vaccine because the B cells in my body that were able to retain a memory of what that meningitis actually looks like on the surface in terms of the antigens and what antibodies match it, maybe they're all dead. And so I need to reintroduce that vaccine in my body to enable the new memory B cells to retain that antibody making ability. So B cells in general, I remember antibody B cell. So that's how I remember that. Antibodies with a B come from B cells. And when stimulated, these memory B cells will divide and differentiate and secrete massive amounts of antibodies. So let's say I do get a booster shot for meningitis. My body's initial response, the primary response to that, is going to be a fairly decent immune response. But if you compare that to the time that I'm actually introduced to the live, active meningitis pathogen, the secondary response is going to be a flood of antibodies. Like, hey, this is our chance. We got an invader and we know how to kick its butt. Let's secrete millions and millions and millions of antibodies. And that's how you won't get sick with meningitis, thanks to that vaccination. So what do these antibodies look like? These are proteins secreted by B cells, remember antibody B cell, for the purpose of attaching to antigens on abnormal cells. So remember antigens, an antibody will match up to it. And the reason why it happens is because, see this little, looks like a puzzle piece here on this big Y-shaped protein. There is a matching of the antigen to this. So it's kind of like that lock and key mechanism I mentioned in previous lessons where the surface of an antigen has a unique protein conformation or protein shape, and this matches that. So what do the antibodies do? Well, the antibodies that are attaching to some kind of pathogen on the surface of it, they're not only helping to mark it like, hey, this is a sitting duck that needs to be eaten up, but it also prevents them from further damaging tissues. So antibodies serve a few different functions. But there are 5 types of, or classes of antibodies. And the reason why we say that is you've got the heavy chain, the blue part here, and then this little orangish reddish part is the light chain. Down here, it's always going to be the same. But the variable region is due to different kinds of light chains that you're going to add on to modify what the shape of this here is on the tops of the Y shape. And another nickname for antibodies is immunoglobulins. And it's because this is a globular protein that's going to be found in your bloodstream, and it has to do with immunization. So Immunoglobulin, that's what the IG means. IgG, IgE, these are the 5 different classes of antibodies in terms of their types. And in more advanced classes, you'd have to know, like in immunology class, you'd have to know exactly what these are for. But I just want to introduce you to the terms. So this is a type of antibody, and IG is immunoglobulin. And I mentioned this in the previous slide about primary versus secondary response. Primary response is when you are, let's say, introduced to a vaccination. The initial flood of antibodies is it's fairly significant in terms of your B cells' reaction to it. But the secondary response, if you were to measure how much of an immune response there is in terms of the flood of antibodies, this is way bigger. And that's a good thing. That primary response, introduction of that pathogenic antigen from the dead pathogen or inactive pathogen, is preparing your body for when the real thing could possibly be introduced to you. All right, immune conditions and disorders. An allergy, there's probably a lot of genetics having to do with this. So an allergy is an umbrella term for a reaction your body has to some kind of stimulation, some kind of stimuli that is going to irritate your immune system in a sense. So I have minor allergies to grass, minor allergies to pollen and pet dander. But I had a dog growing up. I didn't get full-on anaphylactic shock or a deadly kind of allergic reaction. All that would happen is I would get a stuffy nose. So I have minor allergies to certain allergens, to certain particles that if I inhale them, I get a little bit of swelling in the nasal cavity. That's it. So allergies, it probably has a lot to do with genetics in terms of how sensitive your body is to these different things in your environment. But the irony of allergies is that it's your immune system overreacting to something that is actually not deadly. So some people are deathly allergic to bee stings. The average person, when they get stung by a bee, it's like no big deal. Your body deals with that little amount of venom that's injected into you, but not a big deal. Peanut allergies. There's nothing that's deadly about peanuts, but it's the allergic reaction to that chemical that is deadly. So allergies, there might be some environmental triggers early on in life that also have to do with it, but we can't ignore the potential genetics in terms of why certain people's bodies react in a crazy way. So anaphylactic shock is when somebody does have a severe allergic reaction to something like a bee sting or something like even penicillin, which comes from a certain kind of mold, or peanuts, like I mentioned earlier. I've worked with students that were so deathly allergic to peanuts that just the airborne oils, some of these kids couldn't even go in older planes where they used to hand out peanuts, every flight to the passengers, because the oils from the peanuts are in the fabrics of the seats. And being exposed to just those oils causes their body to react so severely that you get massive inflammation all over the body, and swelling in areas like the throat could suffocate them completely. And I mentioned earlier, I believe it was in the hormones lessons, that from the endocrine system, an EpiPen, an epinephrine pen, if somebody is at risk of going into anaphylactic shock from a severe allergic reaction, they're going to carry around a pen that's close to this size. That's an injection kind of emergency item, and it's an epinephrine pen. They're injecting adrenaline to constrict their blood vessels and save their life. They still need to go to the hospital though. An autoimmune disease is something like rheumatoid arthritis is an example. That's where, unfortunately, your white blood cells are attacking healthy tissues. And rheumatoid arthritis, over time, you actually have white blood cells attacking joints in terms of the tissue within the joints. Autoimmune diseases typically don't have a cure, but there are treatments that can help delay the long-term effects of them. HIV/AIDS. So HIV is human immunodeficiency virus. AIDS is acquired immunodeficiency syndrome. HIV is the actual virus. This is a picture of it, a computer-generated image of it. That's a virus that either enters your body because of sexual fluid exchange or blood contact, blood-to-blood contact. So the ways that people typically get it is unprotected sex, blood transfusions where there was an accident where they didn't know that the donor had HIV, unfortunately, accidental needle sticks, sharing needles with drugs or tattoos outside of a tattoo parlor. But HIV, this virus is really good at invading helper T cells. And over time, as the virus makes more viruses, invades more helper T cells, eventually your white blood cell count gets low enough to the point where that person gets AIDS. And that's where, ironically, you end up dying from something like the common cold or chickenpox or pneumonia, those illnesses that the average person, the average healthy person, can beat. But if you have this virus in your white blood cells that are allowing you to beat it, it's not going to work out. HIV is an RNA virus, more specifically a retrovirus, which means it has RNA and then makes DNA within your cells, which is kind of like backwards transcription. If you took biology, you may remember that. Eventually, I believe there will be a vaccine or a cure to AIDS. There are lots of issues in the way of that, but there's a lot of money being poured into it, and time will tell. Cancer. Cancer, I have it here in the immune conditions disorders because cancer is basically cell division out of control, abnormal cell division. So if you have healthy natural killer cells, you may not get cancer, well until your 90s or hundreds even. And by then, it might be a heart attack that kills that person. But cancer can happen in virtually any tissue of the body. Usually it's exposure to carcinogens, which are cancer-causing chemicals, or radiation that causes damage to the DNA that's regulating the cell cycle. And if that cell cycle, the regular amount of cell division supposed to happen, is out of control, that tissue can become a malignant tumor that's going to spread potentially through your lymphatic tissues to other organs, and that's how cancer ends up killing a person. So yeah, the Western medicine approach typically is radiation projected on the cancerous tissue, chemotherapy, but there are other methods that people try to get rid of cancer. Lymphomas. Lymphomas is a disease, has to do with abnormalities in terms of your lymphocytes being able to deal with infections. One example is Hodgkin lymphoma, but there are many different classes of lymphomas, a disease that impacts the lymphocytes. Lymphedema is edema of the lymph. So I mentioned edema before with blood circulation, but this has to do with the lymphatic vessels. So let's say those valves, I mentioned the valves that keep lymph going in one direction and from pooling. If those valves start being dysfunctional, the pooling of lymph, the backup of lymph, can cause severe swelling in lymph tissue, and that's known as a lymphedema. Graft rejection, if you get an organ donation, maybe it's a kidney, maybe it's a new liver, they will give you immune suppressing drugs to keep your immune system from freaking out, because remember that MHC thing, if those proteins are not exactly as they should be from your normal DNA, you're going to get what's called graft rejection, where your immune system is going to attack that newly introduced tissue. And it could be something as simple as a skin graft. Maybe the person was a burn victim and needed skin grafts from a cadaver. Tonsillitis, that's an infection of the tonsils, and they also call them adenoids. They're collections of, they're like miniature lymphoid organs in the throat region. If you get a lot of throat infections, especially as a child, you get a lot of swelling of the tonsils because the swelling is your body's response to that pathogen in your throat. It can be very uncomfortable and really irritating. So they'll go in and sometimes take out your tonsils, a tonsillectomy. So it depends on the person. I did not get a tonsillectomy when I was a kid. I guess I didn't get enough tonsillitis to qualify. But taking out the tonsils, it's not a vital tissue. It's just something to get rid of that annoying swelling and pain. You'll still be able to combat that particular pathogen without the tonsils. Thank you for watching Educator.com.